My daughter forgot to hang up the phone. As I slipped it into my pocket, her voice came through clear as day. He goes into the state facility on Monday. We list the villa for $2.5 million on Tuesday, she said. He won't even know what day it is. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply pressed record on my smartwatch, wiped my paintbrush, and began locking down my empire. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my own flesh and blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a heavy price. My name is Calvin Reed. I am 65 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I believed I had a loving family. I spent 30 years as a forensic auditor for commercial construction. I made a career out of finding the lies people buried in paperwork, tracking embezzled funds, and exposing corporate fraud. But the biggest lie of my life was the one standing right in front of me, wrapped in the disguise of my only child, Melanie. Growing up, Melanie had everything she ever wanted. When her mother passed away a decade ago, I poured all of my grief into making sure my daughter never felt the void. I paid for her expensive college degree, funded her lavish wedding to her husband Jared, and supported their lifestyle far more than I should have. I retired to a beautiful $2.5 million coastal California villa, a place I bought with cash after decades of grueling work. I enjoyed the Pacific breeze, the smell of the ocean, and the quiet peace of my golden years. But my daughter and her husband saw my peaceful retirement not as a reward for a lifetime of hard work, but as an inconvenience delaying their payday. The sun was warm that afternoon. I was out on the cedar deck wearing my old work overalls, carefully applying a fresh coat of wood stain. The physical labor felt good. It reminded me of honest work, a concept my daughter and son-in-law clearly never grasped. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I wiped my hands on an old rag and answered. It was Melanie. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with an exaggerated theatrical concern she had adopted over the last few months. "Are you remembering to drink water out there in the sun? And did you take those memory supplements I bought you?" The manipulation had been subtle at first, just little comments here and there about my age. I told her I was perfectly fine, just finishing up the deck. She sighed heavily over the phone, the kind of dramatic sigh meant to make me feel old and incapable. "Just be careful, Dad. You know how confused you have been getting lately. You forgot your keys just last week." I had not been confused at all. I knew exactly where I had left my keys, but they had somehow magically moved from the counter to the refrigerator while Jared was visiting. I had let it slide at the time, assuming it was a harmless prank or a genuine mistake. I told Melanie I would be careful, said goodbye, and slipped the phone back into the pocket of my overalls to return to my painting. But Melanie forgot to press the red disconnect button. The fabric of my pocket rubbed against the screen, keeping the line wide open. As I bent down to pick up my brush, I heard a voice echoing faintly from my pocket. It was Jared. He sounded panicked, completely out of breath, as if the walls were closing in on him. "The shadow investors are giving us until the end of the month, Mel," Jared said, his voice trembling with terror. "If we do not have the cash by then, they are going to take everything. They are going to on us. We are in a massive hole." I froze. Shadow investors. What was Jared talking about? I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone, holding the speaker close to my ear. Then came my daughter's voice. It was not the sweet, concerned tone she had used with me just seconds before. It was ice cold, calculating, utterly ruthless. "Stop panicking, Jared," Melanie snapped. "We just need the doctor to sign the dementia forms by Friday. He goes into the state facility on Monday. We list the villa for $2.5 million on Tuesday. He won't even know what day it is." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A state facility. Dementia forms. Selling my home. The air was knocked completely out of my lungs. I stood there on the cedar deck I had built with my own hands, looking out at the endless blue ocean, while the two people I trusted most in the world casually planned my destruction over an open phone line. Every little thing over the past few months suddenly made terrifying sense. The misplaced car keys that Melanie swore I had lost. The new specialist doctor she insisted I see because my regular physician was supposedly unavailable. The memory supplements that always left me feeling slightly groggy and disoriented the next morning. They were not caring for me. They were intentionally gaslighting me. They were setting the stage to declare me mentally incompetent, to save themselves from a massive debt I knew nothing about. A weaker man might have pulled the phone to his mouth and screamed. A weaker man might have cried and begged his daughter for an explanation, demanding to know how she could be so evil. But I spent 30 years tracking down criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear, being extremely careful not to touch the screen and disconnect the call. With my other hand, I tapped the face of my smartwatch, opened the voice memo application, and hit record. I held my wrist near the phone's speaker and captured every single word of their continued conversation. I recorded Jared anxiously asking if the new doctor was guaranteed to play ball. I recorded my own daughter laughing coldly, stating that the doctor was an old college roommate of Jared's, who owed them a massive favor and would sign whatever medical evaluation they put in front of him. I recorded their entire conspiracy, securing the exact evidence that would eventually seal their fate. When the line finally went dead, I stood in the absolute silence of my backyard. The ocean waves crashed against the shore below, completely indifferent to the fact that my family had just died in my heart. I looked at the wet paintbrush in my hand. Meticulously, I wiped the bristles on the rag until there was not a single drop of stain left. It was a highly methodical action, something to ground me while my mind shifted completely from a loving father to a forensic auditor preparing for war. I walked inside my beautiful home, the house they thought they were going to steal from under me, the sanctuary they planned to sell to pay off their own greedy mistakes. I walked straight past the living room and went directly to the master security control panel mounted in the hallway. Melanie and Jared had the access codes. They had physical keys. They thought they had free reign over my life and my property. With a few swift, deliberate taps on the digital screen, I deleted their user profiles from the home security system. I changed the master passwords to a complex alphanumeric code only I knew. I disabled the remote garage door openers that were connected to their smartphones. As the system chirped to confirm the new security protocols, a cold, unbreakable clarity washed over my entire being. They thought they were dealing with a confused, vulnerable old man. They thought I would quietly fade away into some horrific state-run facility while they cashed in the chips of my life's work. They assumed I was an easy target, a stepping stone to fix their financial ruin. But they had forgotten exactly who I was. I walked over to the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt, feeling the incredibly satisfying click of the solid metal sliding into place. I was no longer a victim waiting for the ambush. The war had just begun, and I had just seized the absolute high ground. I spent 30 years as a forensic auditor in the commercial construction sector. When multi-million-dollar high-rise projects went over budget and investors started asking questions, developers sent me in to find the leaks. I hunted missing decimal points, phantom contractors, and invisible shell companies. People think numbers are boring, but I learned very early that while people will lie to your face with a smile, a paper trail never lies. I read paper trails the way a seasoned sailor reads the incoming tide. It is a second language to me. So when the initial shock of my daughter's hot microphone confession began to settle into a cold and hardened resolve, my first instinct was to check the physical perimeter of my sanctuary. I walked down the long sunlit hallway of my coastal California villa. The hardwood floors were spotless, and the walls were lined with photographs of a family I now realized was nothing more than a carefully constructed mirage. I entered my private study. It was a quiet room lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves and smelling faintly of old paper and sea salt. I walked around my heavy oak desk and knelt on the floor. I pulled back the Persian rug and deactivated the hidden biometric lock on my heavy steel floor safe. Any forensic auditor worth his salt knows that you never leave your most valuable assets in the obvious place. You always leave a decoy for the desperate amateurs. Inside that safe, I kept a dummy copy of an old, legally outdated property deed from 10 years ago. It was a worthless piece of paper, completely unattached to the current trust that actually owned my home. I ran my fingers over the meticulously arranged manila folders inside the steel box. My heart beat a slow and steady rhythm. The dummy deed was gone. The implication was absolute. My own daughter and her husband had been inside my safe. They had rummaged through my personal space, violating the sanctity of my home, while I was likely out running errands or buying the very groceries I used to feed them. They assumed they had found the holy grail of my estate. The cold, mechanical anger inside me hardened into absolute focus. They thought I was losing my mind, but they were the ones leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious a blind man could follow it. I knew Jared would be back. Thieves always return to the scene of the crime when they think they hold all the cards and their target is oblivious. I needed to see exactly how bold my son-in-law was willing to be. I immediately drove to a specialized electronics store a few towns over. I purchased a high-definition micro-camera, the kind designed for corporate espionage that fits seamlessly inside the spine of a hardcover book. I returned to my study and placed it discreetly on the top shelf, nesting it between two thick historical biographies. I angled the tiny lens perfectly to capture the entire span of my filing cabinet and the heavy oak desk. I synced the live encrypted video feed directly to my smartphone. Then I went to the kitchen and began brewing a pitcher of sweet iced tea. I did not have to wait long. Less than 2 hours later, the doorbell chimed through the house. I opened the front door to find Jared standing on my porch. He was dressed in expensive, pristine golf clothes, flashing that arrogant, practiced smile he always wore when he was about to ask for a favor. "Hey, Calvin," he said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "I was just driving through the neighborhood and realized I desperately need to borrow your laser level for a quick project at the house. Do you mind if I grab it from the garage?" I let him in, slipping effortlessly into the role of the accommodating and slightly forgetful father-in-law. I told him the tools were out back and mentioned that I was just pouring some fresh iced tea. I asked him if he wanted a glass to cool down. Jared agreed, eagerly wiping beads of sweat from his forehead. But as I turned toward the kitchen island, I stopped and tapped my forehead as if trying to remember something. I told him I needed to check the basement first to see if I had left the laser level down there on my workbench. I told him to make himself at home and that my study was open if he needed a quiet place to make a quick phone call. I walked down the basement stairs, making sure my footsteps were loud and heavy against the wood. As soon as I reached the bottom step, completely out of sight, I pulled out my phone and opened the secure camera application. The high-definition video feed flickered to life on my screen. I watched the live broadcast of my study. Jared peeked out into the hallway to ensure I was truly gone. Then his casual demeanor vanished. He moved with a frantic, desperate, and erratic energy. He slipped straight into my study, ignoring the books and the computer. He went directly to my bottom filing cabinet, the exact drawer where I kept my old tax returns and archived checks. I watched through the glowing screen of my phone as my son-in-law pulled out a thick stack of personal documents. He took out his smartphone and hovered over my desk. He began rapidly photographing my signature from the bottom of every single page. Click after click. He was gathering clean and undeniable copies of my handwriting. He was harvesting the exact curves, pressure points, and loops of my signature to forge the legal power of attorney documents they had talked about on the open phone line. I stayed in the shadows of the basement, my blood running as cold as ice, but my mind operating with surgical precision. When Jared finished his espionage, he carefully put the files back, trying to leave the cabinet exactly as he found it. But an auditor always knows when a file has been moved a quarter of an inch. I waited another minute, took a deep breath, and walked back up the stairs, carrying the laser level I had retrieved from a bottom shelf. When I entered the kitchen, Jared was standing casually near the granite island counter. 2 glasses of iced tea were already poured. He slid one across the smooth surface toward me, his hand trembling just a fraction of an inch. "I poured this for you, Calvin," he said, his voice dripping with fake, sickening warmth. "You need to stay hydrated at your age. We worry about you." I looked at the tall glass. I looked at Jared. There was a slight powdery white residue floating near the ice cubes, slowly dissolving into the amber liquid. It was nearly invisible, but I had spent my entire life looking for microscopic anomalies. Jared had slipped something into my drink while I was allegedly searching the basement. A mild sedative. Something to make me groggy to artificially induce that mental confusion Melanie had so cruelly mocked over the phone. They needed me to look incompetent, sluggish, and lost for the rigged doctor visit they had planned for Friday. They were physically drugging me in my own home to build their false narrative. I smiled at him with every ounce of restraint I possessed. I thanked him for his profound concern. I told him I would take the tea out to the deck to enjoy the ocean breeze, and I handed him the laser level. We walked to the front door together. He gave me another fake, stiff hug, telling me to take care of myself and to get plenty of rest, because the coming week was going to be busy. I stood in the open doorway and watched his luxury sports car pull out of my driveway, a vehicle funded entirely by the violent shadow investors he owed his life to. The exact second his car disappeared around the corner, I walked back into the kitchen. I did not hesitate. I carried the tampered glass of iced tea straight to the stainless steel sink and poured it directly down the drain. I watched the clouded, drugged liquid vanish, swirling away, just like my tolerance for their existence. I rinsed the glass with scalding hot water, sterilizing my home from his poison. I took my phone out of my pocket. I did not call the police. The police would only slap Jared with a minor trespassing or tampering charge. That was entirely too kind for what they were attempting to do to me. I needed absolute and total financial and legal destruction. I dialed a number I kept memorized for absolute emergencies. The line rang twice before a sharp, aggressive voice answered. It was Vincent Cole. Vincent was not a friendly family lawyer. He was a corporate attack dog, a ruthless man who dismantled fraudulent companies and bankrupted corrupt executives for sport. I hired him 10 years ago to structure my estate specifically because he had zero mercy for parasites. "Vincent," I said, my voice steady, cold, and hard as granite. "It is Calvin Reed. I need you to drop whatever you are doing right now. My daughter and her husband have breached my safe and are actively forging my signature to seize my assets. They just attempted to drug me in my own kitchen to fake a dementia diagnosis." I heard Vincent take a sharp breath on the other end of the line, the distinct sound of a predator catching a fresh scent. "Tell me exactly what you need, Calvin," he replied, his tone shifting into pure combat mode. I looked out the massive window at the sprawling coastline, staring at the $2.5 million view they thought they were going to steal from under me. "I need you to initiate Protocol Ironwood," I told him without a single ounce of hesitation. "And I need it done today." 2 days later, my daughter insisted we take a drive. She told me she had scheduled a routine checkup for me with a brand new specialist. She claimed my regular physician of 15 years was too outdated and too old-fashioned to catch the subtle nuances of my supposed cognitive decline. I sat in the passenger seat of her luxury car, watching the beautiful California coastline roll by, while listening to her play the role of the deeply concerned child. She reached over and patted my knee, and her voice dripped with that sickening, sugary sweetness she had recently perfected. She told me not to worry, because this new doctor was the absolute best in his field, and they just wanted to make sure I was safe and healthy. I simply nodded and looked out the window, keeping my expression entirely blank. I knew I was being driven straight into a trap. We arrived at a sleek, ultra-modern medical building in the most expensive district of the city. There were no warm colors here and no friendly receptionists. Everything was glass-polished steel and cold marble. It looked less like a place of healing and more like a high-end corporate law firm. We were ushered into a pristine examination room almost immediately. I sat on the edge of the examination table, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I let my gaze wander aimlessly around the room, playing the part of the tired and slightly disoriented old man they so desperately needed me to be. The door swung open, and the specialist walked in. He did not look like a man who spent his life caring for the elderly. He was young and aggressively handsome, wearing a tailored designer suit under a perfectly pressed white lab coat. His watch alone probably cost more than most people make in a year. He introduced himself with a slick, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He did not speak directly to me. He did not ask me how I was feeling or if I was experiencing any discomfort. Instead, he turned entirely toward my daughter and treated me as if I were a piece of broken furniture taking up space in his pristine room. Melanie immediately launched into her rehearsed script. She spoke in hushed and dramatic tones, detailing a completely fabricated history of my mental decay. She told the doctor that I had been wandering the neighborhood at 3 a.m, looking for my late wife. She claimed I had left the gas stove running on multiple occasions and had nearly burned my beautiful villa to the ground. She wiped a fake tear from her eye and whispered that I was forgetting my own name and becoming a severe danger to myself. I sat there keeping my hands folded in my lap and deliberately slowed my breathing. I looked at the floor and occasionally blinked in feigned confusion to sell the performance of a lifetime. The slick doctor nodded sympathetically and placed a comforting hand on Melanie O's shoulder. He told her that she was incredibly brave for dealing with such a tragic burden. Without asking me a single medical question, without checking my heart rate, my reflexes, or my basic cognitive functions, he declared that my condition was clearly severe and deteriorating rapidly. He stated that I needed to be placed in a controlled and secure environment immediately for my own protection. In the meantime, he said he was going to prescribe a heavy regimen of strong antipsychotic medications to keep me calm and prevent any further wandering. The medications he named were chemical restraints designed to turn a functioning human mind into a compliant and docile shell. I kept my head down, but my eyes tracked his every movement. He turned his back to us, stepping over to the sink to wash his hands, while telling Melanie he would print out the necessary institutional transfer forms for her to review. As he turned away, he left his thick, leather-bound medical notepad resting on the edge of the examination counter just inches from my right hand. I spent 3 decades conducting covert audits in hostile corporate environments, and my hands are much faster than my age suggests. In one smooth, silent, and uninterrupted motion, I slid the heavy leather notepad off the counter and dropped it deep into the oversized pocket of my work jacket. By the time the doctor turned off the faucet and dried his hands, I was staring vacantly at the ceiling, playing the perfect picture of senile oblivion. He handed Melanie the prescriptions and the preliminary commitment paperwork. She thanked him profusely, and her voice shook with manufactured relief. She guided me out of the clinic by the arm, treating me like a fragile glass doll. We drove home in silence. As soon as she dropped me off at the villa and sped away to supposedly fill the prescriptions, I locked my doors, walked into my secure study, and pulled the stolen leather notepad from my jacket. I placed the notebook on my heavy oak desk and flipped it open. I did not need to search for long. There, written in crisp blue ink, was a detailed summary of my medical condition. But the terrifying truth was located at the top right corner of the page. The date on the notes was from 3 days ago. This arrogant, corrupt doctor had written my entire diagnosis, outlined my severe dementia, and authorized my involuntary commitment to a state facility a full 72 hours before he had ever laid eyes on me. I flipped the page and saw a hastily scribbled note in the margin. It was a reminder to call Jared to confirm the remaining wire transfer for the consultation fee. Right beneath that was a personal memo referencing their college fraternity. The final piece of the puzzle snapped firmly into place. This slick, highly paid specialist was not a random corrupt physician. He was Jared U.S. former college roommate, and a brother from his fraternity days bought and paid for to provide the exact legal medical documentation they needed to steal my $2.5 million home. They believed they had effectively boxed me in. They thought the fraudulent medical diagnosis was the final nail in my coffin, and a chain that would drag me quietly into a locked ward while they liquidated my life. But an auditor never accepts the first ledger presented to him. I did not panic, and I certainly did not wait for them to execute their plan. I grabbed my keys, walked straight out to my truck, and bypassed their entire corrupt network. I drove 40 miles away, crossing 2 county lines to reach a highly rated and fiercely independent neurological institute that had absolutely zero ties to Jared or his criminal friends. I walked up to the front desk and demanded a comprehensive self-funded cognitive evaluation. For the next 4 grueling hours, I sat in a sterile testing room with a board of impartial specialists. I completed intense psychological profiling, complex spatial reasoning tests, deep memory recall exercises, and rigorous logic puzzles. I answered every question with the sharp, unyielding clarity of a man fighting for his own life. I recounted historical events, solved advanced mathematical sequences, and demonstrated a level of mental sharpness that surprised even the head physician. When the testing finally concluded, the lead neurologist handed me a thick, officially sealed medical dossier. It was certified indisputable and legally binding proof that my mental acuity was absolutely flawless. I walked out of that clinic holding the ultimate armor, completely immune to their medical trap, and fully prepared to obliterate the fragile house of cards my daughter and her husband had built. I had secured my mental armor, but a shield only keeps you alive. It does not win a war. I needed a weapon. Vincent Cole, my aggressive attorney, was already handling the legal barricades, building an invisible fortress around my assets. But I needed raw, unfiltered intelligence. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, just like my daughter and her husband did. Through a secure recommendation, I hired a private investigator named Sylvia. Sylvia was not a traditional detective. She did not wear a trench coat or sit in parked cars with binoculars hoping to catch a stray photograph. She was a digital ghost. She was a ruthless cyber intelligence expert who could dismantle a person's entire existence from a glowing computer screen in a matter of hours. I met her in a quiet, unassuming coffee shop on the industrial outskirts of the city. I handed her a thick manila folder containing the full names of my daughter and her husband, along with the registered name of Jared's supposedly booming tech consulting firm. I told her I needed to know exactly what kind of fire was burning under them. I told her to follow the money no matter how deep or how dark the trail went. It took Sylvia less than 48 hours to completely crack the pristine facade of Jared's life. We met again in the same quiet coffee shop, sitting in a corner booth far away from the windows. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid a sleek tablet across the wooden table and began to unveil a financial disaster so massive it took my breath away. Jared did not run a successful tech consulting firm. The entire company was a hollow shell built on lies and stolen credibility. 2 years ago, he had taken a massive gamble. He had funneled every single cent of his clients' money into a highly volatile underground cryptocurrency mining operation. He had promised astronomical returns to people who did not forgive empty promises. When the crypto market inevitably crashed, his illegal mining operation vaporized overnight. Sylvia tapped the digital screen, bringing up heavily encrypted ledgers and frantic intercepted email threads. Jared owed a staggering $800,000. And he did not owe this money to a standard bank or a forgiving lending institution. He owed it to shadow investors. These were men who operated strictly outside the law. They were the kind of people who did not send polite collection notices through the mail. They sent violent enforcers to collect their dues. The absolute raw panic I had heard in his voice on the open phone line finally made perfect, terrifying sense. They were drowning in a lethal ocean of debt. If they did not secure a massive influx of untraceable cash by the very end of the month, Jared was going to face a highly violent and very permanent reckoning. My beautiful $2.5 million coastal villa was the only lifeline they had left to steal to pay off a criminal syndicate. A small, foolishly naive part of my heart still wanted to believe that my daughter was simply caught in the crossfire. I desperately wanted to think that Melanie was a terrified wife, blindly following a desperate husband trying to save her family from dangerous men. I looked across the table and asked Sylvia if Melanie was being coerced or threatened into participating. Sylvia looked back at me with cold, sympathetic eyes. She tapped the tablet again, bringing up a brand new set of documents. She told me to take a deep breath and brace myself. What she showed me next extinguished the last remaining embers of my fatherly love. Melanie was not a victim. She was the absolute mastermind of my destruction. Sylvia had successfully accessed a series of deleted cloud files tracing back to an IP address exclusively used by my daughter. Long before the crypto market crashed, and long before Jared was ever threatened by shadow investors, Melanie had been laying the groundwork to steal my home. Sylvia showed me a highly detailed fraudulent property appraisal dated 8 months ago. Melanie had digitally forged the documents, inflating the value of the villa and submitting it to sketchy private lenders to secure a massive bridge loan entirely behind my back. When that illegal loan fell through because my property was quietly locked in an impenetrable trust, she realized she had a major problem. She realized she had to physically remove me from the equation to gain total access to the equity. She was the one who initiated the fake dementia narrative. She was the one who researched the corrupt doctors and found Jared's old college roommate. She was the one pulling the strings of this entire horrific conspiracy. The greed did not start with Jared. It started with my own flesh and blood. I sat in that coffee shop staring at the digital proof of her utter depravity. For 45 years, I had loved that girl with every fiber of my being. I had held her when she scraped her knee as a toddler. I had walked her down the aisle with tears of joy in my eyes. I had built a life dedicated entirely to providing her with safety, comfort, and an abundance of love. But the woman smiling in our old family photographs was completely gone. The person pulling the strings of this horrific plot was a stranger completely consumed by absolute greed. She was willing to lock her own father in a bleak state-run psychiatric ward for the rest of his natural life just to cover up a catastrophic financial mistake. She was perfectly fine with throwing me into a living nightmare so she could maintain her luxury lifestyle. In that precise moment, a profound and icy detachment washed over my entire soul. The father who would have done anything for his little girl died right there at that small wooden table. I was no longer a parent dealing with a troubled child. I was a man fighting for his survival against two ruthless predators who wanted to erase me from the world. I officially severed the emotional cord. I felt no sorrow. I felt no pity. I only felt the mechanical precision of a seasoned auditor preparing to deliver a fatal blow to a corrupt enterprise. I asked Sylvia what their next immediate move was. She did not speak. She simply swiped the tablet screen to reveal a recently intercepted email confirmation. The sender was Melanie. The recipient was a private medical transport company specializing in involuntary psychiatric commitments. The email detailed a scheduled pickup from my exact home address. The date was set for next Monday at exactly 6 in the morning. Melanie had specifically requested an ambulance equipped with physical restraints, indicating in her notes that the patient might be highly combative and severely confused. They were not waiting for the end of the month. They were coming to take me by force in exactly 5 days while the neighborhood slept. The clock was ticking and the trap was snapping shut rapidly. I thanked Sylvia, paid her invoice in cash, and walked out into the cool evening air. I had less than 120 hours to entirely dismantle their reality before they arrived with a straitjacket. The trap was set for Monday morning, but my daughter and her husband could not resist securing their prize ahead of time. On Thursday evening, they announced they were coming over to cook a special family dinner at the villa. They claimed it was to spend quality time together to make up for my supposed recent bouts of confusion. I knew exactly what it was. It was a reconnaissance mission. They needed to ensure the package, meaning me, was docile and ready for the incoming ambulance. They did not come alone. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Melanie holding a platter of roasted chicken and Jared standing next to a man I had never seen before. Jared introduced him as Marcus, a close friend from his college days who was visiting the coast for the weekend. Marcus wore a sharp suit, but his eyes darted around my home with the hungry, calculating gaze of a scavenger. He did not look at the family photos or the ocean view. He looked at the crown, molding the condition of the hardwood floors and the layout of the open-concept kitchen. I knew immediately who this man was. Sylvia, my investigator, had warned me that Jared was desperate for a massive influx of untraceable cash to appease his shadow investors. This man was not an old college friend. He was a shady real estate developer, a predator looking for an off-market cash deal on a $2.5 million property. They sat at my dining room table pouring expensive wine and filling the air with hollow laughter. But the main course they served that evening was a meticulously coordinated campaign of psychological warfare. The aggressive gaslighting began before we even finished our salads. I placed my reading glasses next to my water glass. When I turned to answer a question from the developer, Melanie casually slipped her hand across the table and knocked my glasses into her purse. A few minutes later, when I reached for them, she immediately feigned a look of deep sorrow. She placed her hand over mine and asked if I was feeling okay, telling me I had never brought my glasses to the table. She said I had left them in the bathroom and told me I was becoming dangerously forgetful. I played the part flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump. I offered a weak apology and stared down at my plate, acting as if my mind was slipping away into the fog. Jared chimed in perfectly on cue. He casually walked over to the kitchen counter where I always keep my car keys. With a smooth sleight of hand, he slid them into his pocket. 10 minutes later, he asked if I could move my truck so their developer friend could park closer to the garage. When I went to the counter to grab my keys, they were gone. Jared and Melanie spent 10 minutes aggressively searching the house, treating me like a helpless toddler. Jared magically found the keys buried inside a bag of flour in the pantry. He held them up with a look of manufactured pity, shaking his head and telling our guest that my condition was getting worse every single day. Their performance was relentless. During dessert, I told a story about my late wife, Diane, and how we used to walk along the beach collecting sea glass. It was a beautiful memory. As soon as I finished speaking, Melanie let out a loud theatrical sigh. She looked at her husband, and then at their guest, with eyes full of fake, tragic tears. "Dad," she whispered softly, touching my arm. "You just told us that exact same story 5 minutes ago. You do not remember telling us this story already." I had absolutely not told the story twice, but I nodded slowly, putting my head in my hands, acting devastated by my own supposed mental decay. I let them believe they were breaking me down. I let them feel the absolute thrill of absolute control. Then came the true purpose of their visit. When the plates were cleared, Melanie reached into her designer bag and pulled out a large, thick envelope. She smiled sweetly and pulled out a glossy, oversized birthday card. She told me it was for her Aunt Susan, who was turning 70 next week. She handed me a heavy, expensive pen and asked me to sign the bottom right corner so she could mail it out in the morning. I took the card in my hands. The paper felt strangely stiff. It was unusually thick for a standard greeting card. A lifetime of auditing corporate documents had taught me to feel the weight of paper. I pressed my thumb near the edge and felt the unmistakable texture of a carbon copy transfer sheet hidden perfectly beneath the glossy cardboard layer. They were not asking me for a birthday wish. The card was a custom-designed signature pad. Beneath the innocent birthday greeting was a legally binding power of attorney document giving Jared and Melanie total control over my estate. They just needed my exact signature to press through the carbon layer, perfectly aligning with the fraudulent legal paperwork hidden underneath. They watched me with bated breath. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. They needed the signature to execute the sale of the villa the moment the ambulance locked me away. I held the pen over the paper. A normal person would have thrown the card in their faces. A normal person would have demanded they leave the house immediately. I am not a normal person. I smiled a vacant, confused smile and pressed the pen firmly against the paper. I signed my name, but I did not sign my real name. Forensic handwriting analysis is a very precise science. A man's signature is defined by muscle memory pressure points and the specific angles of his loops. For 30 years, I audited forged checks. I knew exactly how to break a signature so that any legal auditor would instantly flag it as a complete forgery. I intentionally altered the angle of the capital letter in my name. I broke the connecting line between the letters, and I applied the wrong physical pressure on the downward strokes. To the naked eye, it looked like Calvin Reed. To a bank, to a judge, or to a federal investigator, it would immediately register as a fraudulent, desperate forgery. I handed the card back to my daughter. She snatched it from my hands with a gleam of absolute triumph in her eyes, completely unaware that she was holding a worthless piece of garbage that would only guarantee her a prison sentence. With the prize secured, the dinner quickly wrapped up. Jared announced that he and his friend needed to step into my private study to make a quick business call regarding a project they were working on. He asked if I minded. I waved my hand vaguely, playing the tired old man, and told them to take their time while Melanie helped me clear the table. I grabbed a stack of dishes and walked slowly into the kitchen, turning my back to my daughter. The moment I was out of her sightline, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the encrypted application connected to the microcamera I had hidden inside the spine of a book in my study just a few days prior. The high-definition video feed buffered for a second before displaying a crystal-clear view of my heavy oak desk. Jared and the shady developer were standing in the center of the room. The developer unzipped his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He dropped it directly onto my desk. The audio feed picked up their hushed voices perfectly. The developer told Jared that there was $50,000 in untraceable cash inside the envelope. It was a non-refundable advance for the off-market purchase of my villa. Jared greedily snatched the envelope, checking the stacks of $100 bills. He shook the developer's hand and promised him that the property would be completely vacant and legally ready for transfer by next Tuesday morning, right after the ambulance took me away. I stood in my kitchen watching the live broadcast of my son-in-law selling my home out from under me to a criminal. I pressed the save icon, securely backing up the high-definition video and audio files to 3 separate encrypted offshore servers. The final piece of their criminal enterprise was now securely in my possession. I drove into the city the very next morning. I did not take the scenic coastal route. I took the fastest, most direct highway, operating with the cold efficiency of a man who had entirely removed emotion from the equation. I parked my truck in the underground garage of a sleek, glass-fronted high-rise and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The offices of Vincent Cole did not look like a traditional law firm. There were no warm wood panels or comfortable leather armchairs. It was all sharp angles, polished concrete, and aggressive modern art. It was an environment built to intimidate, and Vincent was the absolute master of his domain. Vincent was waiting for me in his private conference room. He was a tall, remarkably imposing man with sharp features and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had a thick file already open on the long glass table. I sat down across from him and handed him the high-definition video file of Jared and the corrupt real estate developer, along with the physical birthday card containing my intentionally flawed signature. Vincent reviewed the evidence in silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of professional admiration and lethal intent. He confirmed that the evidence was ironclad. My daughter and her husband were fully committed to a criminal conspiracy. They believe they have me completely cornered. I told Vincent, my voice devoid of any lingering sadness. They think the villa is in my personal name. They think this forged power of attorney combined with their corrupt doctor's medical evaluation will give them immediate legal authority to liquidate the property as soon as the ambulance takes me away on Monday. Vincent let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cold sound entirely devoid of humor. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers, looking at me with absolute professional respect. "But they are dealing with an auditor," Calvin Vincent said smoothly. "And auditors do not leave their most valuable assets exposed to amateur thieves." He was absolutely right. When my wife Diane passed away 5 years ago, The profound grief had almost broken me. But the grief also brought a harsh, unyielding clarity. I realized that without Diane, my massive estate was a prime target. I knew the statistics regarding elder financial abuse, and I refused to become a statistic. So I hired Vincent to restructure everything. I quietly and legally transferred the absolute deed of the $2.5 million coastal villa entirely out of my personal name. The house, the land, and every single asset tied to the property was legally owned by the Ironwood Trust. I was the sole, impenetrable trustee. No power of attorney forged or otherwise could ever penetrate the corporate veil of that trust without my explicit in-person biometric authorization. Melanie and Jared had spent months plotting to steal a house that technically did not even belong to me. They were trying to rob a ghost. I leaned across the glass table and looked Vincent directly in the eye. I am done playing defense, Vincent. I want to liquidate the asset, and I want to do it immediately. I want this entire property gone before they even realize what hit them. Vincent's eyes sharpened. Liquidating a $2.5 million property usually takes months, Calvin. Appraisals, inspections, open market listings. If we list it publicly, Jared's corrupt developer friend will see it, and they will immediately accelerate their timeline. They will panic and likely attempt something desperate. I shook my head firmly. I am not putting a sign in the front yard, Vincent. I am not dealing with open houses or financing contingencies. I want you to completely bypass the open real estate market. I want you to utilize your private corporate networks and find me a quiet, all-cash institutional buyer. Vincent raised a single eyebrow, his sharp mind already calculating the variables. An off-market cash buyer is going to demand a significant discount, Calvin. You will take a massive financial hit for a rapid, completely unlisted transaction. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I told him to list the asking price at a flat $2 million. A $500,000 discount, a devastating financial hit to any normal homeowner. But I was not a normal homeowner. I was a man buying his absolute freedom from a toxic bloodline. The $500,000 loss was the price of a flawless, untraceable execution. I demanded an absolute 7-day closing period. No structural inspections, no financing delays. A pure, clean, completely invisible transfer of assets. Vincent did not argue. He recognized the tactical brilliance of the move. He immediately began making encrypted phone calls to private equity firms and foreign investment groups who specialized in rapid, high-yield real estate acquisitions. Within 48 hours, the trap was perfectly primed. A highly aggressive foreign investment firm looking for prime California coastal property to add to their corporate retreat portfolio eagerly accepted the terms. $2 million, all cash, no contingencies, closing in exactly 7 days. The closing date was legally scheduled for the following Tuesday. I sat in my study reviewing the final digital contracts Vincent had securely transmitted to my tablet. A profound sense of tactical satisfaction washed over me as I checked the calendar. The timing was an absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. Melanie had casually mentioned earlier that morning that she and Jared were planning a quick business trip to Colorado for a 4-day conference. They were leaving on Thursday and returning late Sunday night strategically out of town right before the ambulance was scheduled to arrive for me on Monday morning. They were leaving the gates entirely unguarded. They were going to be hundreds of miles away, celebrating their impending victory, completely unaware that the very ground they thought they owned was being legally sold right out from under their feet. The foreign investment firm was wiring the funds, and the closing date aligned perfectly with their absence. The checkmate was locked in. My daughter walked into my living room on Wednesday evening, carrying a designer overnight bag, and wearing a smile so remarkably bright it could have blinded a lesser man. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost artistic. She glided across the hardwood floors of the villa, touching the furniture and trailing her fingers along the expensive countertops, with the unmistakable energy of a woman who believed she already owned every single object in her path. Jared followed closely behind her, dragging a heavy leather suitcase. He was sweating slightly. The pressure of his massive underground debt was clearly gnawing at his nerves, but he forced a tight, rigid smile when he saw me sitting in my armchair. Melanie approached me and crouched down, resting her hands softly on my knees. Her perfume was overwhelming, sweet, and expensive. She looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes she used to use when she was a little girl, asking for a new bicycle. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly, manufactured affection. "Jared and I have a wonderful opportunity. His consulting firm has been invited to an exclusive 4-day executive conference in Aspen. It is a huge step for his career, and we are going to fly out tomorrow morning. I am going to tag along to enjoy the spa and get some fresh mountain air." She spoke with such fluid, practiced ease that it was genuinely terrifying. She told me she had prepared a stack of prepackaged meals and meticulously labeled them in the refrigerator so I would not have to worry about cooking. She pointed to a brightly colored pill organizer she had left on the kitchen island, reminding me to take my memory supplements exactly on schedule. She was painting the perfect portrait of a devoted, loving daughter, ensuring her fragile elderly father was safe and secure while she briefly stepped away to support her hard-working husband. I played my part flawlessly. I reached out and patted her hand, offering a weak, tremulous smile. I told her how proud I was of Jared and how much they both deserved a relaxing getaway. I promised I would eat the meals and lock the doors at night. Jared stood near the entryway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, completely unable to maintain direct eye contact with me. A seasoned auditor learns to read body language just as well as financial ledgers. Jared was vibrating with the frantic, panicked energy of a cornered animal about to make a desperate leap. He just wanted to get out of the house and secure his stolen payday. They stayed for exactly 45 minutes, projecting the illusion of a happy family evening before heading to their own apartment to finish packing. The very second their car pulled out of my driveway, my encrypted tablet vibrated on my desk. It was an urgent, heavily classified transmission from Sylvia, my private investigator. Sylvia did not deal in rumors. She dealt in absolute, verifiable data. She had intercepted a series of highly secure flight manifests, hotel bookings, and digital calendar appointments. There was absolutely no executive tech conference in Aspen. The entire trip was a meticulously orchestrated operational cover. Sylvia laid out the reality of their movements with chilling precision. They were flying into Colorado specifically to rendezvous with the shady real estate developer we had caught on the hidden camera just days prior. The legal strategy behind their out-of-state travel was incredibly devious. By leaving California and crossing state lines, they were intentionally moving away from local jurisdiction. The developer had secured a corrupt notary in a small mountain town who was willing to process and stamp the fraudulent power of attorney and the early sale agreements without requiring my physical presence. They were going to sign away my $2.5 million coastal villa over glasses of expensive champagne in a snowy resort town completely insulated from anyone who might recognize me or ask inconvenient legal questions. Sylvia outlined their exact timeline. They would land in Aspen on Thursday afternoon and execute the fraudulent paperwork on Friday morning. The developer would immediately wire the initial chunk of the illicit cash directly into an offshore shell account controlled by Jared, thereby satisfying the violent shadow investors who were hunting him. Melanie and Jared would then enjoy a luxurious weekend celebrating their massive payday before flying back to California late Sunday night. And then came the most sinister detail of all. Sylvia had accessed the dispatch logs of a private medical transport company. My own daughter had pre-authorized an involuntary psychiatric ambulance pickup for exactly 6 a.m. on Monday, the very morning after they returned. They were leaving the state to securely steal my wealth, and they were returning just in time to watch strange men drag me from my bed and lock me in a state-run dementia ward for the rest of my natural life. I read Sylvia's report sitting in the quiet shadows of my study. I felt a profound, icy stillness settle deep into my bones. They had left the gates entirely unguarded. They were so blinded by their greed and so confident in my supposed mental decay that they were voluntarily removing themselves from the chessboard during the most critical phase of the operation. They believed they had effectively paralyzed me. They did not realize they had just handed me the keys to their absolute destruction. Thursday morning arrived wrapped in a thick, cool layer of ocean fog. I stood on the mahogany porch of the villa waiting as their luxury sports car pulled into the circular driveway. The trunk was already loaded with expensive ski gear and designer luggage. Melanie stepped out of the passenger side and walked up the stone steps to say her final goodbyes. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized sunglasses. She looked completely radiant, vibrating with the toxic thrill of a predator about to secure a massive kill. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pulling me into a deep embrace. I stood there on the porch, holding my only child against my chest. It was a profoundly devastating moment. I breathed in the scent of her hair, and I remembered the tiny girl who used to hold my hand while walking along the beach collecting sea glass. I remembered the decades of sacrifice, the late nights working to pay for her education, the endless efforts to give her a perfect life. But the woman I was holding was not that little girl. The woman in my arms was a ruthless architect of my demise. She was a stranger entirely consumed by an insatiable greed. I was a surgeon standing over a gangrenous limb, knowing that amputation was the only way to save the host. It hurt with an intensity that defied language, but it was absolutely necessary for my survival. I pulled back and looked her directly in the eyes. I gave her a warm, gentle smile, playing the loving, oblivious father one final time. I told her I loved her, and I wished her a very safe flight. She smiled back, her eyes hidden behind the dark lenses of her sunglasses, and told me she would call me the minute they landed in Aspen. Jared honked the horn lightly, waving from the driver's seat. Melanie turned, walked down the stone steps, and slid into the car. I stood completely still on the porch, keeping my hands casually tucked into the pockets of my sweater. I watched the luxury vehicle reverse out of the driveway, merge onto the coastal road, and disappear completely into the morning fog. While I walked back into the silent, empty house. I did not move toward the kitchen to eat the fake meals she had prepared. I did not look at the memory supplements she had left on the counter. I walked straight into my study and opened a highly accurate commercial aviation tracking application on my computer. I typed in the exact flight number Sylvia had provided. I sat in the heavy leather chair watching the digital interface. I watched as the small blue icon representing their commercial jet taxied down the runway at the international airport. I watched the icon gather speed. I watched it lift off the ground. I monitored the altitude parameters with the cold, mechanical patience of a sniper. 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. The moment the aircraft crossed 35,000 feet, I knew they were completely trapped in a pressurized metal tube with absolutely no cell service and no ability to turn back. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a prepaid, untraceable burner phone I had purchased with cash days earlier. I dialed a highly secure logistical contact number. The line rang exactly twice before a rough, professional voice answered. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries. I stared out the massive windows at the crashing ocean waves and spoke with a voice entirely stripped of mercy. "The targets are airborne," I said, my words cutting through the silence of the room. "The perimeter is entirely clear. Bring in the extraction team. It is time to erase this house." The second my daughter's flight vanished past 35,000 feet, I initiated the erasure of my life from that coastal villa. I did not hire a local moving company. I hired a specialized relocation team that catered to high-net-worth individuals going through messy divorces or hostile corporate takeovers. They were expensive, highly efficient, and absolutely discreet. They arrived in unmarked box trucks exactly 20 minutes after I made the call, backing right up to my garage out of sight from the main road. I stood in the center of the grand foyer and directed the operation like a general dismantling a forward operating base. I had exactly 48 hours to completely strip a $2.5 million estate while maintaining the absolute illusion from the street that nothing had changed. My daughter and her husband were checking my home security cameras remotely from Aspen. They thought they had eyes on the property. What they did not know was that I had looped the security camera feeds to play pre-recorded footage from 3 days ago. To them, the house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely undisturbed. To anyone inside, it was a synchronized military operation. We started with the irreplaceable items. I packed up everything that belonged to my late wife, Diane. Her jewelry, her favorite books, the delicate china sets she had collected over our 40-year marriage. I packed every single photograph, every photo album, and every piece of family history. I systematically erased all evidence that my daughter had ever been a part of my life. I threw away her childhood drawings, her graduation portraits, and the silver-framed wedding photo that used to sit on the mantel. They were no longer memories. They were remnants of a fraud. I watched the moving crew wrap up my heavy oak desk, my custom workshop tools, and every piece of significant furniture. By Friday evening, the entire villa was completely empty. It echoed with the hollow, haunting sound of a vacant building. But an empty house is a dead giveaway. I needed the illusion to hold until the absolute last second. So I had the moving company bring in cheap, generic rental furniture used for staging open houses. We placed a hollow cardboard television on a flimsy stand in the living room. We set up a lightweight dining table and 2 fake leather armchairs. We arranged it perfectly, so that if anyone looked through the massive front windows from the street, the house appeared completely normal and lived in. I walked through the staged rooms, marveling at how cheap and hollow it felt. It was the perfect physical manifestation of my daughter's relationship with me. On Monday morning, just as the sun was beginning to burn the fog off the Pacific Ocean, I drove into the city to finalize the execution. I walked into the private banking suite where Vincent Cole was waiting. The representatives from the foreign investment firm were already seated around the polished mahogany table, flanked by their own aggressively expensive lawyers. They did not care why I was selling a prime coastal property for cash with 0 contingencies. They only cared about closing the deal rapidly. Vincent handed me the thick stack of closing documents. I read through every page, applying the same rigorous scrutiny I used during my 30 years as a forensic auditor. The deed transfer was flawless. The release of liability was absolute. The Ironwood Trust was completely insulated from any future claims. I took a heavy silver pen and signed my name. This time I did not alter the signature. I signed with perfect, undeniable clarity. The bank manager authorized the wire transfer. I sat in silence as the digital confirmation hit Vincent's encrypted tablet. $2 million cleared and fully settled, routed through 3 layers of corporate shielding directly into my secure offshore account. The money was completely untouchable. It was immune to domestic lawsuits, immune to forged power of attorney documents, and absolutely immune to my daughter's greed. I stood up and shook hands with the foreign investors. They thanked me for a swift and professional transaction. I walked out of the bank with Vincent. He looked at me, a rare, genuine smile crossing his sharp features, and told me that the trap was fully primed. I thanked him for his brutal efficiency and drove back to the coastal villa one last time. It was noon when I arrived. The driveway was empty. The ocean breeze was cool and sharp. A sleek black SUV pulled up behind my truck. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They were the property management team hired by the foreign investment firm to formally take possession of the asset. They walked up the stone steps with a clipboard and a ring of heavy new deadbolts. I stood on the cedar deck I had restained just days before. I looked out at the ocean, taking one final mental snapshot of the view I had earned through a lifetime of labor. I felt absolutely no sadness. I felt no regret. I felt the profound electric thrill of a man who had successfully outmaneuvered his own assassins. I walked down the steps and met the property managers in the driveway. I handed them the heavy brass keys to the front door. They nodded respectfully, thanking me for vacating the premises so quickly. They immediately began changing the locks, securing the perimeter for the new owners. The gates were officially closed and the lock had been permanently turned. The timeline was incredibly tight, but the execution was flawless. The corporate buyer's property management team arrived right on schedule. They were not standard locksmiths. They were a highly specialized security firm accustomed to securing multi-million-dollar assets for foreign investors. They brought heavy-duty equipment and moved with a crisp military efficiency. I stood in the driveway and watched as they dismantled the entire security infrastructure I had installed over the past decade. First, they attacked the physical barriers. They drilled out every single brass deadbolt on the exterior doors, replacing them with high-grade commercial locks that required specialized key fobs. The satisfying heavy sounds of drills and grinding metal echoed through the empty driveway. They did not just change the keys, they completely replaced the electronic mechanisms on the massive cedar garage doors, wiping the old access codes and installing new encrypted receivers. Melanie and Jared's remote clickers, the ones currently sitting in their luggage somewhere in Aspen, were now completely useless pieces of plastic. Next came the digital perimeter. The security team stripped out my old cameras and installed a comprehensive, high-tech surveillance network. The new cameras were sleek black domes positioned at every possible entry point, equipped with motion sensors and direct uplinks to a private security dispatch. Anyone attempting to breach the property would be met with an immediate armed response. As they worked, I walked up the stone steps and stood on the wide mahogany porch. I had built this porch with my own hands shortly after Diane and I bought the property. I remembered the long weekends measuring the cuts, staining the wood, and setting the posts. I remembered the summer evenings we spent sitting out here watching the sun sink below the Pacific horizon, dreaming about watching our grandchildren play on this very deck. A normal man standing on the porch of the home he was abandoning forever might have felt a crushing sense of loss. A normal man might have cried. But as I ran my hand along the smooth mahogany railing, I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, crystalline clarity of survival. This house was no longer a home. It was the bait in a lethal trap, and I had successfully removed myself before the jaws snapped shut. I was not losing a home. I was shedding a massive liability. The emotional detachment was complete and absolute. I turned my attention to the heavy custom-built front door. The new security team had just finished installing the commercial-grade lock. I pulled a thick, waterproof, tear-resistant envelope from my jacket pocket. I had meticulously prepared its contents the night before, ensuring every single document was perfectly arranged for maximum psychological impact. I took a roll of heavy-duty industrial tape and secured the envelope firmly to the center of the door, right at eye level. It was impossible to miss. Inside that envelope was the culmination of their betrayal, packaged and delivered with brutal efficiency. The first document they would find was the official legally binding eviction notice from Vanguard Holdings. It clearly stated that the property had been sold, that they had absolutely zero legal standing, and that any attempt to enter the premises would be treated as felony trespassing. The second layer consisted of the high-resolution, full-color photographs printed on glossy photo paper. There was the crystal-clear image of Jared hunched over my desk, his phone out photographing my signature from my private tax returns. There was the image of the forged power of attorney document. And finally, there was the screenshot of the shady developer handing Jared the thick envelope containing the $50,000 illegal cash advance. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof that I knew absolutely everything. And right on top of those damning photographs, I placed a short handwritten note. I did not write a long emotional letter. I did not ask them why they did it, and I certainly did not offer them any path to redemption. I wrote with the steady, unyielding hand of a man delivering a final sentence. I taped the envelope securely, pressing the edges down hard against the wood. I stepped back and admired the simplicity of the package. It was a perfectly constructed bomb waiting patiently for them to return and detonate it themselves. I turned my back on the villa and walked down the driveway to my heavy-duty pickup truck. It was loaded with the few boxes of personal items and memories I had decided to keep. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and merged onto the coastal highway. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove north, heading steadily toward the state line, putting miles of distance between myself and the toxic ruins of my former life. About 2 hours into the drive, the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the highway. I pulled into a brightly lit, busy gas station near the border to refuel. As the pump hummed, I reached into the center console and pulled out my old smartphone. The screen was dark, but I knew that within 24 hours, it would be flooded with frantic, desperate calls and threatening text messages. They would try to track my location, trying to salvage their shattered plan. I walked over to a large, rusted industrial dumpster sitting near the edge of the parking lot. I held the phone in my hand for a brief second, feeling the smooth glass and metal. This device was my last tether to Melanie and Jared. It was the final string connecting me to the nightmare they had orchestrated. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I tossed the phone directly into the dark, foul-smelling depths of the dumpster. I walked back to my truck, completely severing my digital footprint. I was no longer a target. I was no longer on their grid. I climbed back into the cab, merged onto the dark interstate, and vanished entirely into the night. I did not need to be physically standing on the mahogany porch to witness the final act of their destruction. The foreign investment firm that purchased my property had installed a state-of-the-art perimeter surveillance network. Because I had negotiated the installation terms directly with their security contractor, I retained a highly secure, encrypted read-only access link to the exterior cameras. I sat in the quiet safety of a small motel room, hundreds of miles away, staring at the glowing screen of my tablet. The California coastal night was dark and quiet. At exactly 11:15 on Sunday evening, a sleek black luxury rideshare vehicle pulled into the circular stone driveway of the villa. The trap was officially sprung. Through the high-definition audio feed, I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration inside the vehicle before the doors even opened. Jared pushed open the passenger door. He was holding a half-empty bottle of expensive champagne. He stepped out into the crisp ocean breeze, laughing loudly, his face flushed with the arrogant glow of unearned victory. Melanie slid out of the other side of the vehicle, wearing her pristine white cashmere coat. She held a crystal champagne flute in her hand. They had spent the entire flight from Aspen drinking and celebrating their supposedly brilliant execution of a flawless crime. They believed they had successfully signed my home away. They believed the massive influx of illicit cash was already clearing Jared from his lethal underground obligations. They walked to the back of the vehicle to retrieve their heavy designer suitcases. I watched them tip the driver generously, tossing cash with the reckless abandon of people who thought they had just secured a $2.5 million payday. The black vehicle quietly reversed out of the driveway and slipped away into the night, leaving them completely alone on the quiet, dimly lit property. They dragged their luggage up the stone walkway toward the front entrance. They were chatting animatedly about the ambulance that they had scheduled to arrive in just a few short hours. Melanie laughed a sharp, cruel sound, telling Jared that they needed to act properly, devastated when the medical transport team arrived to haul me away. They stepped up onto the mahogany porch. The motion sensor lights above the heavy front door flooded the area with a bright, clinical white glow. Jared set his heavy leather suitcase down on the wooden planks. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his metal keychain. He took a sip from his champagne bottle, smiling at his wife, and confidently slid his brass key toward the deadbolt. The key stopped dead against the metal cylinder. The new commercial-grade lock installed by the corporate security team completely rejected his entry. Jared frowned. He jiggled the key, applying more pressure, attempting to force the metal into the slot. The lock responded with a harsh scraping sound, completely impenetrable. He muttered a curse under his breath, complaining that the salt air must have warped the internal mechanism. He pulled the key out, wiped it on his jacket, and tried again. It was useless. The door remained a solid, immovable barrier. Melanie sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by his sudden incompetence. She told him to stop messing around and just use the electronic security keypad mounted on the doorframe. Jared dropped his keys back into his pocket. He reached out and punched his secure 4-digit code into the digital keypad. The system emitted a sharp, loud, discordant beep. The small LED screen above the numbers flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red light. Access denied. Jared blinked in confusion. He wiped his thumb, thinking he had simply pressed the wrong button in his drunken celebration. He carefully retyped the code, pressing each digit with slow, deliberate focus. The system beeped again. The red light flashed brighter. Access denied. The arrogant smile completely vanished from Jared's face. The alcohol-induced warmth faded into a sudden, creeping anxiety. He rapidly punched the buttons a third time, mashing the code into the device. The security panel let out a long, continuous warning tone, permanently locking him out of the digital interface due to multiple failed attempts. The red light pulsed continuously in the dark. Melanie stepped forward, her annoyance morphing into sharp frustration. She demanded to know what he had done to the system. Jared backed away from the door, his hands trembling slightly, insisting that the system was broken. As Melanie stepped closer to the heavy wooden door to inspect the glowing red keypad, she finally noticed the center of the door. Taped securely at her exact eye level was the thick, waterproof, tear-resistant envelope. The motion sensor light cast a stark shadow across the heavy industrial tape, holding it in place. She stared at it for a long second, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the envelope. She pulled hard. The thick tape ripped away from the wood with a loud tearing sound that echoed sharply across the quiet porch. She held the heavy package in her hands. Jared moved closer, leaning over her shoulder, the half-empty champagne bottle hanging forgotten at his side. Melanie tore the top of the envelope open. She reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of documents. The first item was the formal, legally binding eviction notice from Vanguard Holdings. She stared at the corporate letterhead, her eyes scanning the legal terminology. I could see the exact moment her brain struggled to process the words. It stated clearly that the property was under new corporate ownership and any unauthorized presence constituted felony trespassing. She quickly shuffled the legal document to the back, revealing the glossy high-resolution photographs I had meticulously printed. She stared at the crisp, undeniable image of her husband hunched over my private desk, committing felony forgery by photographing my signature. She moved to the next photograph, revealing the visual proof of Jared accepting the $50,000 illegal cash advance from the corrupt developer. Her hands began to shake violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp. It hit the mahogany deck and shattered into dozens of tiny glittering pieces, the expensive liquid soaking into the wood. Beneath the damning photographs was the final piece of paper. It was my handwritten note. Melanie pulled it to the front of the stack. Her hands were trembling so aggressively that the paper fluttered in the ocean breeze. Jared stared at the note, his face drained of all blood, looking like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. Melanie opened her mouth. She read the words aloud, her voice wavering, echoing through the hidden microphone directly into my quiet motel room. The nursing facility was a great idea. She read her breathing, becoming shallow and erratic. I picked a tropical one. The house legally sold on Tuesday. Good luck with the $800,000 crypto debt. Dad. She stopped reading. The absolute crushing gravity of her reality descended upon her like a collapsing building. She realized instantly that the entire criminal enterprise was dead. The millions of dollars she thought she had secured were gone forever. The house they were standing in belonged to a ruthless foreign corporation. The illegal contract they had just signed in Aspen was completely fraudulent and entirely worthless. And worst of all, the violent, unforgiving shadow investors were still coming for their $800,000, and Jared no longer had a single asset left to sell. Melanie let the papers slip from her trembling fingers. The eviction notice, the undeniable photographic evidence, and my final message scattered across the wooden planks, mingling with the shattered glass and spilled champagne. She slowly fell to her knees on the hard deck. She tilted her head back toward the dark, indifferent sky. She let out a guttural, primal scream of absolute ruin. It was a harrowing, animalistic sound of pure, inescapable devastation. The horrific wail echoed loudly through the silent, wealthy neighborhood, marking the exact moment my daughter realized her life was completely over. I calmly closed the video application on my tablet and turned off the screen. The echoes of my daughter's primal scream had barely faded into the cool night air before panic completely overtook her. Through the secure audio feed on my tablet, I listened as her breathing turned jagged and erratic. She scrambled across the wooden planks of the porch on her hands and knees, frantically gathering the scattered documents. She pulled her sleek smartphone from her cashmere coat and rapidly dialed my number. She expected the confused, compliant old man to pick up the line. She expected to use her tears and her manufactured desperation to manipulate me into fixing the catastrophic reality she had just discovered. But the number she dialed no longer existed. I had terminated that cellular account hours ago. She listened to the automated carrier message informing her that the line was disconnected. The digital voice repeated the absolute finality of her situation. She dropped the phone from her ear and stared at the dark screen. Jared was pacing behind her like a caged animal, muttering incomprehensible curses and running his trembling hands through his hair. He demanded to know what they were going to do. Melanie ignored his panic. She swiped aggressively through her contacts and found the only other number that could possibly connect her to my estate. She called the private law office of Vincent Cole. I was thousands of miles away, sitting comfortably on a sun-drenched balcony, overlooking the lush, vibrant jungles of Costa Rica. A gentle tropical breeze moved through the palm trees. I held a glass of iced mineral water in my hand. My secure proxy phone began to chime. It was Vincent. He told me they were calling his emergency after hours line just as we had anticipated. He asked me if I was ready to deliver the final psychological blow. I took a slow, deep breath of the clean ocean air and told him to patch the call through securely. The line clicked and connected. Melanie did not wait for a greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical tirade. She screamed into the receiver, demanding to know where her father was. She demanded to know what kind of illegal stunt the law firm was trying to pull. She claimed she had legal rights to the property and threatened to sue Vincent for everything he owned if the house was not immediately returned to her control. She played the role of the outraged protective daughter, flawlessly, completely unaware that Vincent had transferred the call directly to me. I let her scream until her lungs ran out of air. I let her exhaust every single ounce of her manufactured outrage. When she finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, clinical precision of an auditor presenting a final, devastating ledger. "Hello, Melanie," I said smoothly. The absolute silence that followed my greeting was profound. I could hear the wind brushing against the microphone of her phone. I could hear Jared stop pacing in the background. The shock of hearing my steady, lucid voice completely paralyzed her. "Dad!" She stammered, her tone instantly shifting from aggressive rage to a fragile, trembling whine. "Dad, what is going on? There are fake eviction papers on the door. The locks are changed. Are you okay? Did someone force you to do this? You are not thinking clearly. We need to get you to a doctor right now." Even standing in the absolute wreckage of her conspiracy, she was still trying to play the dementia card. She was still trying to gaslight me into believing I was the victim of my own broken mind. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to regain control. I took a sip of my iced water and set the glass down on the small table next to me. "I am thinking perfectly clearly, Melanie," I replied. "In fact, I recently visited an independent board of neurologists who certified that my cognitive functions are absolutely flawless. I passed every test they put in front of me. There will be no state facility for me on Monday morning. And there will certainly be no $2.5 million real estate listing on Tuesday." I heard a sharp, sudden gasp escape her throat. She recognized those exact words. She knew exactly where they came from. But before she could try to formulate a lie to cover her tracks, I pressed a button on my tablet. I played the audio file I had recorded on my smartwatch directly into the phone line. The recording played back with brutal, undeniable clarity. Her own cold, calculating voice echoed out of the speaker. "We just need the doctor to sign the dementia forms by Friday. He goes into the state facility on Monday. We list the villa for $2.5 million on Tuesday. He won't even know what day it is." I let the recording finish. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit in the absolute filth of her own betrayal. There was no misunderstanding. There was no miscommunication. The audio was the ultimate inescapable proof of her total moral bankruptcy. Melanie began to hyperventilate. She tried to string words together, stumbling over her own panic. She tried to say it was taken out of context. She tried to say Jared had pressured her. She tried to offer any excuse that would save her from the horrific reality of the moment. I cut her off completely. I told her I did not want to hear another single word from her mouth. I told her that she was no longer my daughter, and that she had died to me the exact second she decided to throw my life away to pay off a criminal debt. I told her to put her phone on speaker so her husband could hear exactly what was coming next. I heard the rustling of fabric and the beep of the speakerphone being activated. I addressed Jared directly. I told him he was a catastrophic failure of a man. I told him his entire life was built on lies, stolen money, and the weak manipulation of vulnerable people. Then I delivered the final financial strike. I informed Jared that earlier this evening my attorney had placed a very specific phone call. Vincent had contacted the shady real estate developer they had met in Aspen. Vincent informed the developer that the power of attorney document they used to secure the transaction was a complete and total forgery. Vincent also informed the developer that the coastal villa was already owned by a foreign investment firm and could never be sold to him. I listened as Jared let out a low, terrified groan. I told Jared that his corrupt developer friend was furious. The developer knew he had been scammed by a desperate man. I casually mentioned that the developer was currently demanding his $50,000 cash advance back immediately. Furthermore, the developer was fully aware that Jared owed $800,000 to a violent crypto syndicate, and he was more than happy to pass Jared's current location along to those very unforgiving shadow investors. Jared dropped to his knees on the wooden porch. He began to beg. He pleaded with me to wire him the money. He swore they would leave the state and never bother me again if I just gave them enough cash to survive the week. He cried like a broken child, completely stripped of the arrogant facade he had worn for years. I felt absolutely zero pity. I told them both that they had manufactured their own destruction. I told them they were about to learn exactly how unforgiving the real world was when they no longer had a victim to steal from. I did not say goodbye. I tapped the red button on my screen and terminated the call permanently. I sat back in my chair and watched the live security feed on my tablet one last time. Melanie and Jared were left standing on the cold porch, entirely cut off from the world, surrounded by their expensive designer luggage. They had no home, no money, and a legion of dangerous criminals actively hunting them. Suddenly, a set of bright headlights swept across the manicured lawn. A heavy armored security vehicle pulled into the circular driveway. Two armed men in dark tactical uniforms stepped out of the truck and began walking purposefully toward the porch. The property management company had detected unauthorized individuals lingering at the front door of their newly acquired asset. The final stage of their physical removal had just arrived. The sudden arrival of the security vehicle completely shattered the dead silence of the property. The heavy tires crunched aggressively against the gravel driveway. Through the encrypted live feed on my tablet, I watched the exact moment Jared realized the absolute finality of his situation. The house was locked. The massive influx of cash was gone. The shadow investors were actively hunting him, and the shady developer wanted his $50,000 back immediately. The crushing weight of his catastrophic failures finally broke his mind. He looked at the heavy mahogany front door and realized he could not possibly force his way through the commercial-grade deadbolts. Panic consumed his every movement. He remembered that some of his most valuable possessions, his expensive watches, and a hidden stash of emergency cash, were still locked inside the master bedroom on the second floor. Jared sprinted off the porch and ran toward the dark side of the villa. He was panting heavily, his breath visible in the cold ocean air. The pristine landscaping tore at his expensive designer trousers as he pushed his way through the manicured bushes. He frantically searched the ground until he found a large decorative river rock resting near the flower beds. He picked it up with both hands, his face contorted in a mask of pure, feral desperation. He raised the heavy stone high above his head, letting out a desperate, unhinged cry, and hurled it directly at the reinforced glass of the ground-floor study window. The glass did not shatter into pieces. It spiderwebbed with a loud, sickening crack that triggered a secondary perimeter alarm. A high-pitched siren wailed into the night, piercing the quiet atmosphere of the exclusive neighborhood. Before Jared could pick the rock back up for a second strike, a brilliant beam of a tactical flashlight hit him directly in the face. The two armed security contractors had moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They drew their heavy batons and commanded him in harsh, authoritative voices to step away from the structure and put his hands on his head. Jared tried to argue with them. He yelled that he lived there. He screamed that it was his house and he had every right to go inside to retrieve his personal belongings. The security guards did not entertain his arrogant demands. They moved in swiftly, forcing him to the ground and pressing his face directly into the damp grass he used to walk across like a king. Melanie ran around the corner of the house a moment later. Her pristine white cashmere coat caught on the thorny rose bushes, tearing the expensive fabric. She shrieked at the guards, commanding them to let her husband go immediately. The loud wail of approaching sirens cut through the cool ocean breeze. The private security team had a direct automated line to the local police precinct, and the response time in that wealthy neighborhood was less than 4 minutes. 2 black and white patrol cars skidded to a halt near the security vehicle, bathing the entire scene in frantic flashing red and blue lights. 4 police officers stepped out of their cruisers, resting their hands on their utility belts as they approached the chaotic scene on the side of the house. Melanie immediately snapped into her rehearsed performance. She smoothed down her ruined cashmere coat and approached the lead police officer with fake tears streaming down her face. She played the tragic, victimized homeowner perfectly. She told the officer that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. She explained that her elderly father suffered from severe dementia and had somehow accidentally triggered a security lockout while experiencing a confused mental episode. She pleaded with the officers to force the aggressive security team to let them inside so she could care for her sick, vulnerable father. She used her most pathetic, trembling voice, attempting to manipulate the authorities just as easily as she had tried to manipulate me. The lead officer was an older veteran who had spent decades dealing with the wealthy, entitled residents of the coast. He did not immediately swallow her theatrical performance. He looked at the armed security guards and then looked down at Jared, who was still pinned against the wet grass. The officer pulled out his shoulder radio and requested a direct property deed verification through the county database. He asked Melanie for her identification and the full legal name of her father. She provided the details with a confident, entitled nod, completely assuming the local property records still reflected my personal ownership. The radio crackled to life a few moments later. The dispatcher's voice echoed loudly in the damp night air, delivering a fatal blow to the entire reality Melanie had built. The dispatcher confirmed that Calvin Reed did not own the property. The deed had been legally and securely transferred to Vanguard Holdings 5 years ago. Furthermore, a recent corporate sale had finalized the absolute transfer of the asset to a foreign investment firm just 2 days prior. The officer looked at Melanie, his expression hardening into cold, unyielding authority. He informed her that she had 0 legal standing, 0 ownership, and absolutely no right to be on the premises. Melanie tried to protest. She stammered and insisted that the records were wrong and that a mistake had been made. The officer held up his hand, demanding her silence. He turned his attention to Jared, who was slowly being pulled to his feet by the security guards. The officer pointed his heavy flashlight at the spider-webbed glass of the study window. He told Jared that attempting to break into a corporate-owned estate was a very serious crime. He informed him that the security team had every right to press immediate charges for felony destruction of property and attempted burglary. Jared stood trembling in the cold, his designer clothes covered in mud and grass stains. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of all his arrogant bravado. The lead officer delivered his final ultimatum. He told them they had exactly 2 minutes to gather their bags and walk off the private property, or they would both be spending the night in a concrete holding cell. He made it perfectly clear that no one cared about their luggage inside the house or their completely fabricated stories about a sick father. Stripped of all their power, their money, and their pride, Melanie and Jared were forced to comply. They walked back to the front porch under the glaring lights of the police cruisers. They grabbed the heavy designer suitcases they had brought back from Aspen. They dragged their luggage slowly down the long, winding driveway. The police cruisers followed them at a crawling pace, ensuring they did not stop or attempt to turn back. I watched the entire pathetic procession through the security feed, feeling a profound sense of closure. The officers escorted them completely out of the exclusive gated neighborhood. They forced them to keep walking until they reached the edge of the main coastal highway. The patrol cars finally turned around, leaving them standing under the flickering fluorescent light of a dirty public bus stop. The Pacific wind whipped around them, biting through their expensive clothes. They were entirely homeless, completely exposed to the elements, and waiting for a public bus that would not arrive until the sun came up. They had tried to throw me into a cold, unforgiving facility, but they were the ones left shivering in the dark, completely abandoned by the world. The public bus stop was only the beginning of their profound humiliation. After dragging their heavy designer luggage for 2 miles along the dark and dirty shoulder of the coastal highway, my daughter and her husband finally found refuge in a decaying roadside motel. It was a filthy establishment, illuminated by a flickering neon sign, the exact kind of place they would have previously mocked with absolute disgust. Through the compromised camera on Jared's laptop, which my investigator Sylvia had silently hacked hours prior, I sat in my secure location and watched the final pathetic act of their conspiracy unfold. The luxury and arrogance they had paraded around in Aspen had completely evaporated. Jared was sitting on the edge of a sagging, stained mattress. He was holding his smartphone, and the harsh blue light from the screen illuminated a face entirely drained of blood. He was not looking at the news or calling for a cab. He was reading a sequence of highly threatening text messages. The shady real estate developer had already realized the power of attorney was a worthless forgery and wanted his $50,000 cash advance returned immediately. But the developer was the least of his problems. The violent shadow investors who bankrolled his failed cryptocurrency scheme had been monitoring the public property records. They knew the coastal villa had been legally sold to a foreign corporation. They knew Jared no longer had any collateral to cover his massive debt. The messages on his phone were no longer asking for payment. They were explicitly promising physical violence. The dangerous men he owed $800,000 to were actively hunting him, and they knew he was stranded in the city with nowhere left to hide. Panic is a highly predictable emotion. When a coward is cornered, he will always abandon his allies and attempt to run. Jared opened his laptop, his fingers trembling violently against the keyboard. I watched through the hacked webcam as he desperately tried to access his hidden offshore accounts. He completely ignored his wife, who was pacing frantically on the dirty carpet next to him. He was entirely focused on saving his own life. He navigated to an international airline website, attempting to purchase a one-way first-class ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. He aggressively typed in his premium credit card numbers. The screen loaded for an agonizing moment before flashing a harsh payment, declined error. Jared cursed under his breath and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He logged directly into his private banking portal, intending to wire his last remaining emergency funds directly to the airline. But the financial dashboard did not load. Instead, a stark and formal legal notice filled the screen. His accounts were not just empty. They were locked, seized, and entirely frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. Sylvia had been incredibly thorough. She had forwarded a comprehensive dossier of Jared's illegal crypto mining operations, tax evasion, and money laundering straight to federal investigators. The government had clamped down on his entire financial existence with absolute authority. He was completely trapped. He had no money, no leverage, and no possible way to escape the violent men who were currently looking for him. Jared slammed the laptop shut, the sharp sound echoing loudly in the cramped motel room. He turned to face his wife, and the illusion of their glamorous, powerful partnership shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked at Melanie and told her that the money was gone, the accounts were seized, and they were completely trapped. He told her that the investors were going to find them, and that they had absolutely nothing left to offer. Melanie did not offer comfort. She did not reach out to hold her husband in his darkest moment. The polished, elegant woman I had raised transformed instantly into a vicious and cornered animal. She launched off the stained bedspread and screamed at him. She blamed his sheer stupidity for their entire situation. She screamed that his reckless gambling, his pathetic crypto investments, and his total inability to run a real business had ruined her perfect life. She called him a miserable failure who had dragged her down into the gutter. Jared did not back down. The paralyzing fear in his eyes morphed into an explosive and venomous rage. He screamed right back at her, his voice shaking with absolute contempt. He blamed her arrogant greed for the failure of their entire backup plan. He pointed out that she was the one who insisted on forging the legal documents. He yelled that her sloppy, pathetic attempt to fake my signature on that birthday card was the exact reason the developer pulled out and the investors were closing in. He told her that her blinding arrogance and her desperate rush to lock me away in a dementia ward had blinded them to the fact that I was legally outmaneuvering them the entire time. They tore into each other with a breathtaking level of cruelty. They exposed every resentment, every lie, and every ounce of bitter hatred they had harbored for years. It was brutally clear that there had never been any real love between them. Their marriage was nothing more than a shallow, parasitic transaction built on shared greed, and the exact moment the money vanished, they turned into deadly enemies ready to sacrifice one another to save themselves. The screaming match reached a fever pitch, their voices bouncing off the thin walls of the cheap motel. Suddenly, the harsh and flashing glare of red and blue lights flooded through the thin, dusty curtains of their ground floor room. The heavy roar of multiple high-output engines filled the parking lot outside. Jared stopped screaming. All the color instantly drained from his face again. He backed away from the window, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror. He assumed the shadow investors had finally tracked his location and arrived to exact their violent revenge. He raised his hands, trembling uncontrollably, waiting for the door to be kicked off its hinges. Heavy, authoritative knocks pounded against the cheap wooden door. A booming voice commanded them to open up immediately. Jared stood completely frozen, paralyzed by his own profound cowardice. Melanie marched over and ripped the door open fully, prepared to scream at whoever was interrupting her rage. She did not find criminal enforcers standing on the concrete walkway. She found 4 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers, flanked by local police officers. Jared immediately dropped to his knees, raising his hands high in the air, babbling frantically that he surrendered and that he would fully cooperate with the financial fraud investigation. But the lead federal agent completely ignored Jared. He walked straight past the trembling man on the floor and stepped directly in front of Melanie. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He looked her right in the eyes and informed her that she was being placed under federal arrest. He recited the charges with a cold, mechanical precision that echoed beautifully through the live audio feed. She was being charged with felony elder abuse, severe wire fraud, and the criminal forgery of federal medical and legal documents. The trap had not been set for the cowardly husband. The ultimate legal hammer was swinging down directly onto the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. My attorney, Vincent Cole, did not merely submit a standard police report. He delivered an absolute masterpiece of forensic prosecution directly to the federal authorities and the state medical board simultaneously. The dossier he compiled was a flawless weapon of legal destruction. It was bound indexed and completely irrefutable. It contained the high-definition video of the forgery securely backed up on encrypted drives. It contained the financial routing numbers from the shady developer tracing the exact path of the illicit $50,000 cash advance. Most importantly, it contained the time-stamped audio recordings and the forged medical commitment forms. The authorities did not have to spend weeks launching a complex investigation. Vincent handed them a fully solved case on a silver platter. They only had to execute the arrest warrants. The very first domino to fall was the arrogant young specialist who had so casually signed my life away for a fraternity favor. This doctor had built his entire identity around prestige and power. He was standing in the pristine glass lobby of his ultra-modern clinic, sipping an expensive imported coffee and flirting with his medical assistants when the federal agents walked through the automatic doors. They did not wait for him to finish his shift. They did not respect his status or his expensive tailored suit. They handcuffed him right there in front of his wealthy clientele and his completely shocked staff. His medical license was suspended before he even reached the back of the federal squad car. The prosecutor charged him with severe medical fraud conspiracy and attempted kidnapping via involuntary commitment. The sleek suits and the expensive cars could not save him from the harsh reality of a federal indictment. His highly lucrative career was entirely incinerated in a matter of minutes, all because he assumed an old man was too weak and confused to fight back against the medical system. But the true masterpiece of this legal reckoning was taking place inside a sterile, windowless interrogation room deep inside the federal building. Melanie sat alone at a cold metal table. Her pristine white cashmere coat was stained with dirt and grease from her night in the cheap motel parking lot. The designer sunglasses were gone, revealing eyes wide with absolute paralyzing panic. She was entirely stripped of her arrogant armor. Two veteran federal agents sat across from her, placing heavy manila folders onto the scratched metal surface. They did not play good cop and bad cop. They played the cold, clinical executioners of her false reality. Melanie attempted to deploy her usual manipulative tactics. She tried to cry, sobbing into her hands, and playing the role of the overwhelmed, loving daughter who had only made a few naive mistakes while trying to care for an increasingly sick father. She claimed Jared was controlling her every move and that she had absolutely no idea the legal documents were forged. The lead agent did not offer her a tissue. He did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. He simply reached into the thick folder and pulled out a small digital audio player. He pressed a button and let her own cold, calculating voice fill the silent concrete room. He played the exact recording of her plotting to lock me in a state facility to clear the house for sale. Then, he slid the high-resolution photograph of her husband, forging my signature across the table. He pointed out that her own fingerprints were found on the carbon transfer paper hidden inside the glossy birthday card. The agent leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, and outlined the exact charges she was facing. Felony elder abuse, aggravated wire fraud, criminal forgery of federal medical and legal documents. He informed her with a flat, emotionless voice that the combination of these federal charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The color drained completely from Melanie's face. The arrogant illusion she had worn her entire life shattered against the cold, hard floor of the interrogation room. She was no longer a wealthy coastal socialite manipulating her way to the top of the food chain. She was a cornered, desperate criminal staring at decades inside a concrete box. Then the lead agent offered her a lifeline, but it was a lifeline heavily coated in poison. The federal government was deeply interested in the violent shadow investors who had financed Jared's failed cryptocurrency mining scheme. They wanted to dismantle the entire underground syndicate from the top down. They did not just want the low-level tech consultant. They wanted the entire illegal network. The agent slid a formal plea agreement across the metal table. If Melanie provided absolute total cooperation and turned state's evidence against her own husband, she could avoid the maximum prison sentence. She would still be a convicted felon, but she would serve probation instead of spending the next 2 decades behind iron bars. She just had to hand them Jared on a silver platter. A loyal wife might have hesitated. A woman who truly loved her husband might have refused to send him to a federal prison to save herself. Melanie did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed the cheap plastic pen provided by the agent and signed the plea agreement with frantic, desperate energy. She spilled every single secret Jared had ever told her. She handed over his encrypted passwords, the names of his illegal contacts, and the exact routing numbers for his offshore crypto wallets. She completely dismantled the man she had sworn to love and cherish without a single ounce of remorse or hesitation. She threw him directly to the wolves simply to save her own skin. It was the ultimate betrayal, proving once and for all that her loyalty only ever belonged to herself and her own survival. The fallout from her comprehensive confession was swift and absolute. Armed with Melanie's detailed testimony, the federal prosecutors crushed Jared in court. He was completely denied bail due to his significant flight risk and his newly exposed connections to organized crime. He stood in the courtroom and looked at his wife, realizing she was the star witness responsible for locking him away. Jared was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison, surrounded by the very violent criminals he had tried so desperately to outsmart. He had lost his freedom, his wife, and his entire future in one single devastating blow. Melanie avoided the prison cell, but her punishment was far more poetic and enduring. She walked out of the federal building as a free woman, but she was completely and utterly ruined. She was officially a convicted felon, permanently barred from ever holding a corporate position or accessing any significant financial credit. The shadow investors knew she had cooperated with the federal government, making her an absolute pariah, marked for retaliation. She had no money, no home, and no family left to manipulate. She was left entirely destitute, forced to carry the crushing weight of her own greed for the rest of her natural life. She had tried to throw me away like unwanted garbage, but she was the one left to rot in the absolute ruins of the life she had systematically destroyed. 6 months have passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut on my former life. The bitter ocean fog of the California coast is nothing but a distant memory now. Today, the warm golden sun of Costa Rica beats down on my shoulders as I walk along a stretch of pristine white sand. The air here smells of sea salt and blooming hibiscus. I walk with a steady, powerful stride. The slight limp I used to fake and the hunched posture I adopted to play the part of a fragile old man have completely vanished. At 65 years old, I feel more vibrant and alive than I did in my 40s. I am deeply tanned, my breathing is clear, and my mind is as sharp as a diamond. I spend my mornings swimming in the warm turquoise water, and my afternoons designing small community structures for the local villages just to keep my hands busy. I help them map out new schools and reliable water filtration systems, using my decades of commercial experience for something genuinely good. I am entirely free. There are no whispered conversations behind my back. There are no hidden cameras to monitor. There are no pills slipped into my iced tea. I am living the exact retirement I earned through decades of grueling, honest labor. I find a comfortable spot under the broad shade of an ancient palm tree and sit down on the warm sand. I reach into the pocket of my linen shirt and pull out my secure mobile device. There is a single encrypted message waiting for me in my private inbox. It is from Vincent Cole, my attorney back in the States. The subject line simply states that the final legal dust has completely settled. I open the secure file and read through his concise clinical report. The federal prosecutors did not offer any leniency when the gavel finally fell. Jared is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, serving his 15-year sentence. He spends his days locked in a concrete and steel cage, constantly looking over his shoulder, because the violent shadow investors he ripped off have a very long and unforgiving reach inside the prison system. But the most revealing part of the report is the detailed update on my daughter. Melanie avoided a prison cell by turning on her husband, but the federal judge showed absolutely no mercy regarding the financial restitution. She was ordered to pay back every single stolen penny, along with massive punitive fines. Vincent writes that she now lives in a cramped, noisy studio apartment located directly above a commercial laundromat in a very rough part of the city. Because she is a convicted felon with a public record of severe corporate wire fraud and elder abuse, no legitimate company will ever hire her again. The glamorous coastal socialite who used to wear pristine white cashmere coats and drink expensive champagne, now works the graveyard shift at a greasy 24-hour roadside diner. She spends her nights scrubbing dirty plates, serving intoxicated customers, and emptying heavy trash cans just to barely make her court-ordered monthly payments. She is completely trapped in a suffocating cycle of poverty and exhausting physical labor. She has absolutely no luxury cars, no designer clothes, and no wealthy friends left to manipulate. Her reality is a daily punishing grind of survival. I read the words on the glowing screen, and I wait for a wave of emotion to hit me. I wait to feel a sense of vindictive joy, or perhaps a lingering sting of paternal sorrow. But as I look out at the gentle rolling waves of the tropical ocean, I realize I feel absolutely nothing of the sort. There is no gleeful celebration of her misery. There is no tragic mourning for the daughter I lost. I only feel the profound, absolute peace of a master architect who successfully identified a collapsing structure and demolished it before it could crush him. For 30 years, I audited commercial high-rises. I know that when a building has a rotten foundation, you cannot simply paint over the cracks or pretend the steel beams are not rusting away. You have to bring the entire building down to the ground and start completely over. Melanie and Jared were a rotten foundation in my life. They were a toxic, deteriorating weight that threatened to pull me down into the dirt with them. I simply executed a controlled demolition to save myself. I press my thumb against the digital screen and permanently delete the email. I empty the trash folder, completely erasing their existence from my secure device. I do not need to read the report ever again. That chapter of my life is officially and permanently closed. There will be no more updates and no more correspondence. I stand up, brush the soft white sand from my linen trousers, and begin walking back up the beach toward my new property. I did not buy a massive, sprawling villa this time. I purchased a smaller, highly efficient, and perfectly designed modern home nestled right on the edge of the lush tropical jungle. It features massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that open entirely to the ocean breeze, letting the natural light flood every single room. It is constructed from rich local mahogany and sleek polished stone. It is not built to impress arrogant neighbors or host fake friends. It is built strictly for my own comfort and absolute peace of mind. Every inch of the space reflects harmony and intention. I walk up the smooth wooden steps and enter my quiet sanctuary. I walk over to the small, elegant, wet bar situated in the corner of the open living room. I reach up and take down a heavy crystal glass and a bottle of premium 20-year aged bourbon. I pour a generous measure of the rich amber liquid, listening to the satisfying clink of the glass against the bottle. I walk out onto my private wooden deck and lean against the sturdy railing, looking out over the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The setting sun is painting the sky in brilliant shades of deep purple and vibrant orange. I raise my crystal glass up toward the warm evening sky. I speak into the quiet ocean breeze, raising a sincere toast to my late wife, Diane. I tell her that I am finally safe and that the legacy of our hard work is completely secure from the hands of greedy predators. I take a slow, appreciative sip of the smooth, aged bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The tide begins to roll in, pushing rhythmic, soothing waves against the shore. I stand there, bathed in the fading golden light, realizing the absolute magnitude of my victory. It is not a victory born of revenge or malice. It is the pure, satisfying victory of a man who simply refused to be the helpless victim society expected him to be. They looked at my gray hair and my quiet demeanor, and they assumed I was a weak, oblivious target waiting to be slaughtered for my assets. They thought my age made me disposable, but they forgot that true strength does not roar or demand attention. True strength observes, calculates, and strikes with flawless, devastating precision. I built my own rescue, and I protected my own future. I survived the ultimate betrayal, and as I watch the tropical sun dip below the horizon, I know I am finally, completely, and beautifully free. The ultimate lesson from Calvin's journey is that biological ties do not guarantee loyalty, and love should never require the sacrifice of your own dignity. We are often conditioned to endure anything for the sake of family, but true family is built on mutual respect and integrity, not entitlement and greed. When those closest to you view your kindness as weakness and your age as an opportunity for exploitation, the most profound act of self-love is to ruthlessly cut them out. Setting absolute boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of survival. Never let anyone treat you as collateral damage. If Calvin's relentless pursuit of justice resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories of reclaiming your dignity, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled such a betrayal.